So, welcome to all of you again. My pranam. I hope you are having going on smoothly over there. And today we are continuing with our series of lectures concerning Raga-vartma-candrika. This very interesting, in-depth study of Raga Nuga Bhakti by Sri Thakur Vishwanath Chakravarti Bhat, with his Moonray Chandrika, which sheds light on the Raga Vartma, or the path of Raga, sacred passionate love. So today we are in our meeting number 12, and we will start studying verse number 12 as well. First part of it, I think we will discuss along this verse in two classes, two lectures. So we will today start with verse number 12, but as usual, we will make some brief recap regarding our previous meeting where we were finishing our discussion of verse number 11, finishing quote unquote, there is no end to this Ananta Katha. But we spent 5 meetings, if I'm not mistaken, trying to go in detail about this verse, especially about the intermediate verse, because in this verse number 11, the one we are doing summaries now, Sri Vishwanath quotes 3 famous verses of Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, which describe the angas of Raga Bhakti. So the second one, we spent quite a lot of time, especially speaking about the concept of Sadhaka Deha and Siddha Deha and Siddha Pranali, and how to conceive this and how to approach that and so on. So this second verse, for you to remember, that he was saying this, Siva Sadhaka Rupena Siddha Rupena Chatrahitat Bhavalipshana Kriya Brajaloka Nushathanam. Of this path of Raga Bhakti, Sadhaka should serve both in Sadhaka Deha and Siddha Deha, following the wake of the residents, the Brajavasis, desiring to have feelings similar to some associate of Krishna of one's own affinity. So we were already in the previous lectures to this one speaking about this, and our previous lecture we especially spoke about Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur's stance regarding Siddha Pranali, regarding Lila Shmaram, Manasi Seva, and so on. Sorry. So his stance mainly goes in line with Mahaprabhu, the Bhagavat, and the Goswamis also. What the Goswamis said, establishing how all and we will see how Vishwanath himself will make that clear in the following verses as well. But the main point here is Kirtana Prabhava Smarana Svabha. Perfection, we will attain perfection through Kirtan by the proper engagement, chanting, invoking of Siddha mantras. And even though he took a quite conservative stance to the point that he seemed to have rejected the Siddha Pranali altogether, actually he did not do so. He actually rejected its heterodox expression because of the condition, considering time, place, some circumstance, the condition of the sampradaya at that time, with many people engaging in this type of meditation in a cheap way without proper qualification, not only from the perspective of sahaja, of being a cheap embracer of the esoteric practice, but even prakrita sahaja, and justifying illicit immoral behavior in the name of the highest lila. So he spoke up sometimes about this topic, confidential topic. Maybe he even, we say, may have given a kadashabab, these ingredients to some disciples, but this is not something confirmed. So basically with his mission, he tried to reestablish the movement's prestige in society with his dynamic conception of Kirtan, trying to, an all-engaging, all-absorbing issue, Kirtan in its extended forms, and trying to consume one's senses and gradually qualify oneself for further absorption. He made a very strong moral foundation to the practice, as Mahaprabhu himself did as a sannyasi. And also we spent some time at the end of our previous lecture analyzing some of the possible dangers, let's say in contemporary times, of this approach, in the sense of engaging in niyamagraha, like rejecting that altogether because of considering a deviation from the norm, or embracing it without understanding the details of that approach and losing sight of the background and the tradition of our lineage in connection to Raga-marg. And we spoke about that. Rigu Prabhu especially invited me to speak about that in detail. So we mentioned some of these points of the risks of just doing copy-paste of previous stances or previous, let's say, preaching strategies. Also, I should add that nowadays I feel that community, one of the important points for us as contemporary Gaudiya, something that Guru Maharaj stressed a lot, that our present day Gaudiya community should get more united, because they're so diversified, so many various groups, different paribars, so many conceptions are there, and so many bhavs and moods. And we are different in bhav, as Guru Maharaj will say, but we are one in tattva and siddhanta. So that's an important point for nowadays Gaudiya community. Try to feel ourselves part of one big family, Mahaprabhu's family, Gaudiya Sampradaya, and reach that consensus in terms of Siddhanta. And that will be by knowing our foundational writings, Goswami Granthas, special place maybe there, of course, for scriptures like the Sandarbhas of Jiva Goswami and so on, that gradually are being discovered or rediscovered, if you will, by the present members of the Sampradaya. Because again, in Bhava, we may have so many different affinities and modes and lines and details and preaches and strategies, but we can only be one in Tattva. So we should, as a community, focus in that direction, as well as recognizing certain historical differences and distances that have been given between mainly the Gaudiya Math and its branches and the rest of the community, and both parties criticizing each other for some perceived deviation, if you will, from the norm, with good reasons, with bad reasons, learning from the past, learning from mistakes, and trying to, as much as possible, getting closer to each other in terms, mainly, again, first to begin with, in terms of Siddhanta. But yes, after, as also I mentioned, ideally, these topics should be spoken cheaply, that point is still there, but also after 30, 40 years of practice, if you have practiced properly, that's a point to make. You should be willing, open to hear about these things in some level. Again, not because of a number of years of practice, but if you are properly being practicing and proper guidance is there, proper progress has to be there. So naturally, a necessity for in-depth should be there as well in these topics. And also, we finished our previous lecture, just to finish my recap, with we mentioned the third verse of Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu that Vishwanath mentions in this 11th verse, which speaks about hearing, chanting, and other limbs of bhakti that should be also engaged in the path of Raga Bhakti. And one will practice those. Basically, we will practice those items, those who are therefore which favorable to one's own mood, with the exception of those items that are contrary to one's mood. So in that connection, Vishwanath explained in the end of this 11th verse, still in the recap, sorry. But in the end of the previous verse, the 11th verse, Vishwanath explained this third verse of Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, mentioning that the first two verses of Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu describe the subject matters of Smaran and Rajabhas, and the third verse describes the various aspects of bhajan, headed by hearing. Shravanat Kirtana Nadini. Shravan, Kirtan, and so forth. He means engagement in Shravan, Kirtan. Unattained Guru Padasraya, taking shelter of the Guru, and other practices will depend on that, he was mentioning. And by neglecting these main limbs of sadhana, like hearing and chanting, following the resonance of Raj, for example, will not be accomplished. And trying to enter into such esoteric reality won't be there. And to emphasize this point, Rupa Goswami used the word Manishribihi. The thoughtful ones have ascertained this. So Vishwanath concluded his verse by saying this means that intelligent people will use their discrimination to follow the limbs of bhakti that are favorable to their mood, not doing that which is incompatible to their mood. So the whole idea here is we have many angas of bhakti. Today we will continue elaborating on this. Because along with hearing and chanting, main angas of bhakti, there are some other limbs, 64 actually, totally. Rupa Goswami mentions in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. He mentioned all of this in the context of Vaidhi Bhakti, but mentioning the Raga Bhakti, all of this can be applied with some exceptions. So today we will start with that. But the point is, as much as you can, as much as possible, we should follow all these different items of bhajan. But, and the point is there, an intelligent sadhaka should use his discriminating intelligence, his discernment, and not act contrary to his own feelings, her own feelings. No? Those things, those practices that nourish her affinity, those should be embraced, and those who are not doing that, but opposite to that, should be avoided. So today we will begin with verse number 12, which will be an elaboration, further elaboration on this last part of the 11th verse of, if you will, of Raga-vartma-candrika. So I will share the verse. Today again we will see the first part of this 12th verse of the first part of Raga-vartma-candrika, and next class we will see the second part. So here Vishwanath will speak about different practices and different goals that will be attained. So I will share with you the first part of the verse. I mean, the first part I will share in two parts in the chat because it's a little bit long for sharing only one part. Again, this is not just a verse, it's actually a prose, so it's considerably long. So we will be seeing in certain parts. Now we are seeing the first part of this 12 prose, but along today's lecture we may see, no, today no, the next lecture we'll see the remaining parts as well. Okay, so I will read the prose, you can read it also, it's there in the chat. So it says like this. Raganuga sadhakas are herein advised to not practice ahangrahopasana, considering oneself identical with the object of worship. Nyasa, various elaborate practices for chanting mantras and performing archana, meditation on the modes of Dwarka, or worship of Rukmini and the other queens of Dwarka, even though these are included in the limb of archana as mentioned in the Agama Shastras. If, on the path of devotion, there is a slight deficiency on the part of the devotee in engaging in the various aspects of sadhana, it will not be a fault that is known from the scriptures. So first we quote a verse from the Srimad Bhagavatam 11:2-35. O king, a person who takes shelter of the path of devotion will never be in danger. Even if he runs over this path with his eyes closed, he will not trip or fall. And there is a second verse from Bhagavatam, also 11th canto as well, chapter 29, verse 20. Krishna is speaking to Uddhava. He says, O Uddhava, in this endeavor of devotion to me, there cannot be even the slightest loss or destruction. So Vishwanath continues saying, however, there is a fault in failing to practice the angis, main limbs of devotion. The word yang in the former verse, from the last one of the Bhagavad, means that one must take shelter of the angis of Bhagavad Dharma, such as hearing and chanting. Elsewhere, it is also said, exclusive devotion to Lord Hari, which does not follow the rules and regulations prescribed by the Shruti, Smriti, Purana, and Pancharatra, is only causing disturbance. Brahma Jamala, famous quoted verse, Shruti, Smriti, Purana, Adi, Pancharatra, Vidimbida. So, this is the first part of the 12th verse or prose from this first part of the first illumination of Raga-vartma-candrika. So today we will be trying to unfold a little bit the content of this section. And the next meeting we will finish this 12th verse. So here, Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur is mentioning, let's say, remember, in the previous verse, at the end of the previous verse, when he was explaining the third verse of Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, which deals with the angas of Raga Bhakti, he mentioned that one should engage in those practices of Raga Bhakti in such a way that is favorable to one's mood, focusing on Shravan, Kirtan, the main angas of Bhajan, Raga Bhajan, and of course some other practice as much as one can from the ones that Rupa Goswami mentioned originally, but one should be careful and with discernment avoid those things that won't be favorable for one's culture of Raga Bhakti. So in this verse, Sri Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur is mentioning which are those limbs or those aspects that are included in the list, in the angas of bhakti that Rupa Goswami mentions, that won't be favorable for the engagement of raga bhakti. Remember, Rupa Goswami mentioned these 64 limbs in the context of describing Vaidhi bhakti. So these limbs will be favorable for Vaidhi bhakti, the ones mentioned here, but not for raga bhakti. So here, Raghunath Das is mentioning them separately, so we can be aware that those won't be favorable for our affinity in the direction of Braj. So in this way, in this verse, he's mentioning the kind, let's say, of conduct that will go against the feelings a Raganuga sadhaka will be desiring, will be hankering for. We can also present this in the context of the aspect of Saranagati called Pratikulyasya Varjanam, let's say. The devotees in Saranagati, the process of surrender, should accept Anukulyasya Sankalpa, should make a firm vow of accepting whatever is favorable to one's specific culture, and Pratikulyasya Varjanam. One should reject whatever is not favorable to one's culture in the context of Raga Bhakti. So in this case, we could say Vishwanath is listing some of those items that won't nurture, but even can, let's say, dilute, as we will see in the next class, can change our projection in our practice, if you will. So first of all, he mentions a quite pretty obvious one, which is Ahangraha Upasana. So Ahangraha Upasana in general, this means that while one is, all of these points, mainly the first ones, Ahangraha Upasana, Mudra, Nyas, has to do with Archana. So in general sense, Ahangraha Upasana means that while you are engaged in Archana, in worship of the deity, you worship the deity with a sense of non-difference. You will worship Krishna, you will feel, I am Krishna. Of course, this is not our line, but there is an aspect of Archana that has this possibility described in the scriptures. Again, this is not described by Rupa Goswami in his 64 angas. Rupa Goswami actually describes Archana. But since in Archana, there are so many possibilities described in scriptures, these ones that we are seeing here, which are some of those possibilities which are not in our line, are anyhow described in order that we have clear, this is not favorable for us. So Ahangraha Upasana may feel, I am identifying myself with the object of my worship. This can mean two things. One, in a general sense, it can apply to God. I worship God and I feel I am God, which is closer to Mayavad, to Advaita Vedanta, let's say, some form of it. But also in this particular case that Vishwanath is describing Raga Bhakti, this will refer specifically to oneself being fully identified with one's object of worship in the sense of one's role model to follow in Raga Bhakti. To follow in Raga Bhakti, you have a role model eventually. You will follow in the way, you serve in the wake of the feelings of Rupa Manjari, Subal-Saka, Yashoda, Nanda, whoever, Lalita, Vishaka. But you become identified with their feelings. It doesn't mean that you want to become them. In that sense, here there is some caution. So of course, instead of doing this, the Raganuga sadhaka should engage in sadhana, engage in bhajan, remembering the mood, imbibing in the mood of his cherished, let's say, Brajavasis, in relation to which one has some lobha, some greed to follow. But one should not imagine oneself as being Sridham, Sudam, Yashoda, Dalita, Vishaka, etc. This type of worship is prohibited, forbidden here by Vishwanath and by our Gaudiya acharyas. But also this is mentioned, it's important to go to some travel journey in time and understand that in certain moments in time, even when Vishwanath was writing this and so on, there were some sadhakas, so-called sadhakas in this case, let's say, that they were following this Ahangraha Upasana in the name of Raga Bhakti. So they were worshipping Lalita, but at some point they were considering themselves to be Lalita, and they were decorating their, for example, male sadhaka bodies with ornaments meant for a woman and calling themselves Lalita Saki. So this is one of the different upper sampradayas that also Bhaktivinoda Thakur pointed, that you are worshipping internally in the Raga Marg, but also externally you dress your sadhaka deha as if you were a gopi or something like this. Well, this is not the case. This is not the instruction given by Rupa Goswami. He says, Seva sadhaka rupena, siddha rupena. Serve with your sadhaka deha as a sadhaka in the context of Gaur Lila, and internally you will be eventually conceiving your other identity in Braja Lila. So to do this mixing, and what to speak of identifying yourself fully with Lalita or your object of worship, whoever that may be, that represents improper behavior, forbidden and in the established rules of conduct in the scriptures, basically. So in this connection also there's one verse that Vishwanath comments in his Sarartha Darshini, one verse from the Bhagavad, the third canto. There it's mentioned that Bhagavan is imparting a devotee, the devotee a transcendental body, just like the one he was conceiving during her practice. We spoke about that many times already. As you project yourself in sadhana, you will attain a correspondent sadhya or goal. So Vishwanath comments this verse in this connection, mentioning that whatever the devotee desires and meditates upon in the stage of sadhana, she actually will attain that on the completion of his sadhana, her sadhana. But the point is, it doesn't mean that you will become Krishna or Nanda. Even if you imagine that, you may practice and think, I'm Jashoda. You won't be Jashoda as much as you think about that. There are specific Nitya Parishtars, Swarup Shakti Jivas, and so on. And we are something else. So we can follow in the wake of their emotions. And that's why this practice of Ahangraha Upasana is really totally rejected. Like something that is actually not a part of the angas of the bhakti we are following, our practice of bhakti, Uttam Bhakti. So after mentioning Ahangraha Upasana, there is the mention of mudra. Nyasa and mudra, actually. One is quite closely related to the other. So there are here and there some mudras in our Gaudiya tradition. We won't deny that. And even, of course, in the Leela in Vrindavan, the gopis have some mudras, which are different signals and indications in a very, sending messages in a secret way. So that's it in another context. But here mainly mudra refers to different prescriptions that again are present in the scriptures, like showing different signs to the demigods with both hands during formal worship, or at the time of offering asana, offering some special mudras. There are main 16 mudras mentioned there. Or actually, even if during Archana you are offering mudras in your puja as Gaudiya Vaishnava, be careful of not becoming entangled, if you will, in the realm of extreme ritual, if you will, ritualism. That can happen as well. And I have seen that. So you can become overtly, excessively attached to the external ritual itself without understanding which is the purpose of the ritual, the purpose of the rule, if you will. And nyasa is similar. It's like invoking the presence of Krishna in different parts of the body as well. Different types of nyasa. There are sad anganyas, pitta nyas, anganyas, karanyas, many. So there are like elaborate procedures that also are prescribed for chanting mantras or performing archan. But again, this has been here established as unfavorable to the mood of raga bhakti, because we will elaborate why, but maybe I think you can understand what's the point. I mean, it takes your attention into a different mood, into a direction which implies a different mode, that of raga bhakti, that of raj. So again, even if you're engaging in a little bit of that in a certain specific context, it should be in such a way that that's nurturing. That's nurturing your raga bhakti projection, let's say, because it can act as an obstacle nowadays. You can become overtly attached to them or whatever. In the next verse, all these practices will be even further divided into some other categories, like practice saturated with one's own mood, one's own affinity, related to one's own mood, favorable to one's mood, neutral to one's mood or unfavorable to one's mood as well. So now I'm mentioning some idea of this, but even the next verse, not only next part of this verse, but next verse, Vishwanath will continue elaborating. So after speaking about Ahangrahopashana, Nyasa, Mudra, which again are not overtly mentioned by Rupa Goswami, but are implied in all that Archana includes, mentioned in certain scriptures regarding formal worship. After this, Vishwanath mentions here the meditation on Dwarka, on the worship of Dwarka queens like Rukmini and so on, which again is not overtly mentioned by Rupa Goswami, his 64 limbs of bhakti, but have been mentioned in the Agama Shastras, different scriptures that are considered by us also, but in a particular context of the particular type of worship. So again, although these things are mentioned in the Agama Shastras, and one may say, okay, if that's mentioned in Shastra, you should follow. Here there is some exception to that rule. And Vishwanath mentions how a Raganuga sadhaka should not be practicing these items because they opposed, again, the feelings of a Raganuga sadhaka. He will elaborate on this in further detail, especially this last point, the Dwarka queens, in the second half of this 12th verse. We will see that next class. And what's the point? Again, meditation on Dwarka, if you become absorbed in that direction, in the mood of worship in Dwarka, the mode of worship of the Mahishis there, of the queens of Dwarka, well, that will be mainly predominated by Aishwarya Bhav. Aishwarya Bhav. Well, it's not the Aishwarya of Vaikuntha, but there's considerable Aishwarya as well. There's an awareness of Krishna's majesty, position, Krishna's godhood, basically. Again, it's not the same as Vaikuntha, but let's say it's closer to Ayodhya. In Ayodhya, Krishna appears as Ram and is worshipped as a queen, as a king. So in Dwarka, this is similar. Krishna will be like a king there, worshipped in that way, aware, the devotees aware he's God. There is some affection, higher affection than in Vaikuntha. So we could say we have Vaikuntha, we have Ayodhya, Dwarka, Mathura, Vrindavan. And even in Vrindavan, we will see there are gradations as well. So all this had been explained by Sanatana Goswami in his Brihad Bhagavatamrita and also by our acharyas. We will see this today and next class as well. So there are different degrees of prem, different degrees of intimacy, basically. So in Dwarka, Krishna is Dwarkesh Krishna. As you know, you have Dwarkesh Krishna, Mathuresh Krishna, Mathura. And in Vrindavan, he's not Brajesh Krishna. No? There, Brajeshwara is Nanda Maharaj. So he's Brajendra Nandan. He's the son of the king of Braj. He's not the king of Braj. And he may be a prince there, but a prince of the cowherds. So it's another dynamic. So here in Dwarka, going back to Dwarka for a moment, he's present as a king. Sometimes exhibiting his chaturbhuj, his arm formed. That it doesn't happen in Vrindavan at all. Or when that happens, I mean, he appears as Narayan joking, and the gopis, they will ask him, where is Krishna? Real Krishna. I don't know who you are, but where is Krishna? So he appears in a total different mood. So it's totally, let's say, I don't want to use the word unfavorable as criticizing it, but it's unfavorable. If you are trying to really nurture an anukul, a favorable mood of service, that's required. That's the official definition of our bhakti. Anukulyasya Krishnanusilanam bhaktirutana. So for example, when the gopis met Krishna in Kurukshetra, there Krishna appears as Dwarkesh Krishna, sometimes 4 arms, big elephant there, royal attire, entourage, big personality, and the gopis say, we cannot join here. Krishna say, come with me to Dwarka. No, let's unite. Let's get together here. And Radharani say, where are you, basically? He said, where is the peacock feather? Where's the flute? Where's your pitambara? Where is Jamuna? Where is the Vrindavan forest? Where are you? Where is my Krishna, our Krishna, Braj Krishna? So again, it was not favorable. The mood was not favorable. We have to understand this point, that there's a great consideration on how, on the proper invoking of moods. If that's not there, union cannot take place, proper experience cannot take place. So we are trying to follow Anubhav, have an experience following to the wake of that. So in Dwarka, again, Krishna, again, is a king, 4 arms. He himself, his Abhiman there, his own sense of identity is more of a Kshatriya. I'm of the ruling military class, king. And the queens, there are also like Kshatriyanis, I think you mentioned that. Kshatriyanis, like female Kshatriyas, royal queens. There's a whole DNA to that. There's a whole psychology to being part of a royal class. So everything is endowed with a high degree of majesty. That's the point. They are the wives of Krishna there, the queens are the wives in a type of Swaki. They are Swakya Bhav. There's no Parakiya there at all. They are married with Krishna according to Vedic injunctions. And their love of the queens, I'm speaking mainly of the queens in the context of, remember, Vishwanath mainly focusing on Kamanuga Bhakti and contrasting that with the love of other ladies in other parts. He will follow this example here as well, by speaking about the queens of Dwarka, as you see, and some other ladies in Mathura and so on. So the love of the queens of Dwarka is called Samanjasa Rati by Rupa Goswami. We have Sadharana Rati, Samartha Rati, and Samanjasa Rati. So Samanjasa Rati is a type of love that Samanjasa means inhibited. It's inhibited by certain elements, by certain rules. Famous example, as we mentioned, is Rukmini. She wanted to get married to Krishna. She sent him a letter, please kidnap me. She was not able to just run after him and transgress social Vedic law and so on. She was calculating that a little bit. So it's inhibited because of that. It's inhibited because of a sense of majesty regarding Krishna. Some Aishwarya is there. So Vaikuntha is full Aishwarya. Dwarka is mostly predominated by Aishwarya with some Madhurya. Some other relationships can be had there with the difference of Vaikuntha. Mathura will be mostly predominated by Madhurya, but there will be some Aishwarya. And Vrindavan will be full Aishwarya. Full Madhurya and full Aishwarya at the same time, but the full Aishwarya is totally buried under layers and layers of Madhurya. That will be discussed in the second part of this book. So the love of the queens of Dwarka is Samanjasa Rati again. It's inhibited Rati because they are inhibited. Krishna, let's say, is inhibited, as you know, somehow or other. He's not fully himself. He's not Swayam Bhagavan. So my point is, all this is not favorable. That's the point of Vishwanath. If you want to nourish your attraction toward Krishna in Braj, whatever may be the affinity, that's a total different picture. Krishna in Braj is Nitya Kishore, eternal, adolescent. He's Dira Lalita Nayaka, very playful, romantic lover. He's expert in dancing, playing, stealing. He does not any of those things in Dwarka. He appears here attired as a cowherd boy, forever accompanied by his flute, and so on. There is this famous description of the Venu Gita. This is like the famous Krishna meditation, if you will. The Krishna we worship in Braj. Bharaha Pidam Nata Narava Pukarnayo Karnikaram Bibhrad Bhasha Kana Kakapi Shambayayan Tinchamalam Randham Beno Radha Rasudayara Rayan Gopa Brinder Brindaranya Sapadaраmanam Pravisha Gita Kirti. So the gopis in their trance are visualizing Krishna and having this still picture of him, that describes him like wearing a peacock feather ornament upon his head, wearing blue karnikar flowers on his ears, having a yellow garment as brilliant as gold, having a Bhajayanti garland. Krishna exhibited his transcendental form there in Vrindavan as the greatest of dancers, Nataraj. And as he entered the forest of Vrindavan, they're entrancing all this happening, beautifying the forest with the marks of his footprints and filling the holes of his flutes with the Adaramrita, with the nectar of his lips, with the cowherd boys singing his glories. This is the Purvana Lila, Krishna entering into the mid-morning pastime to the forest with God. So this is the Braja Krishna, very different, the Dwarkesh Krishna. Now here in Vrindavan again, Krishna's intimate associates are not queens, kings, emperors, but the gopas, the gopis. So, and in this case, in contrast with the love of the queens of Dwarka, which is Samanja Sarati, inhibited Rati, the love of the gopis has been described by Rupa Goswami as Samartha Rati, which means competent love. So not inhibited at all, but on the contrary, very powerful affection, which is capable of controlling Krishna to the extreme, as we know. And this is far superior to the love of the Dwarka queens, the inhibited Samanja Sarati of them. So the conclusion is a Raganuga sadhaka, one who aspires to serve Krishna in Braj, again, here in the context of romantic love, but in whatever context, don't need to follow rules and regulations of Shastra related to meditation on Dwarka and worship of the queens of Dwarka, which is some other aspect mentioned in the Gama Shastras. So, the point that maybe is clear, I think so, hopefully. So, these points, again, the point that Vishwanath mentioned here is, but these points are mentioned in scripture. But we are not advised to follow them, even though they are part of the 64 angas, or one of the implications of one of them, archana. Again, implied in practices like archana. So I will say that this idea also extends not only, of course, to the queens of Dwarka or to the worship of them mentioned in scripture. We should understand the general principle here, which is do not engage, do not dilute your ideal, your prospect, by mixing it with certain elements that won't be favorable to your eternal projection. Be those related to Dwarka or related to some other realm as well. That's the point. As we mentioned the other day, Prabhupada Goswami is saying his Mana Siksha, oh mind, leave your attachment for the Lord of Lakshmi, for Narayan, because that will throw you to Vaikuntha. Like, be careful of not mixing your bhava with those elements if you want to go to Vrindavan, actually. So this idea extends to the worship of other forms of Bhagavan. For example, we also mentioned Ramachandra. Ramachandra is Krishna, of course, we know. But we need to be very careful, and we have lots of appreciation for Ramachandra, and Leela is beautiful. And we offer pranam to that. But how we conceive our approach to the Ram Leela, for example. Actually, we will offer obeisances to Ramachandra thinking, oh Krishna, you have manifested such a beautiful form as Ram, but you are performing this pastime as Maryad Purushotam, as the epitome of rectitude. But we will address Ram as Krishna, actually. Oh Krishna, oh my Krishna, Braj Krishna, you are appearing in this particular unique form. We won't address Ram, but as Krishna, at least internally, that's the point. We will have this proper conception. Actually, he's Krishna in this particular avatar. So we are not worshipping Ram, as separate from Krishna. Even on Ram Navami, occasions like this, when we worship Ram, let's say on his appearance day, we are doing so with the motive that he is Krishna in the form of Ram. Of course, someone who is in the Ram Sampradaya will worship Krishna thinking, oh, he's Ram in the form of Krishna. And a Sri Vaishnava will worship Narayan feeling, oh, whatever. Ram and Krishna are aspects of my Narayan. And from a subjective point, that's okay, each one with their own bhav. And each one with their own siddhanta according to the Sampradaya. So some examples different from Dwarkesh Krishna. Of course, the worship of Krishna in Dwarka in one sense is better than worship of Ram, in the sense it's closer to Krishna. It's Krishna, actually, but in Dwarka. But again, we have been also warned against that. So if we have been words about Krishna in Dwarka, what to speak of, if you will, lesser manifestations of the divine in terms of rasa, like Ramchandra, Vishnu, Vaikuntha. Of course, we are not insulting them, just taking care of nourishing properly our conception. So this has to be done with proper maturity. Krishna in Bhagavad Gita is saying, Sarva Dharmam Parityaja. He's making a very strong clarion call, as Guru Maharaj will say, like no other gods. Leave all Varna ashram aside, which means leave the worship of all the demigods, all the gods, only worship me, Mam Ekam Sharanam Vraja. But here, interestingly, Krishna is not only saying only worship Krishna, but only worship this particular form of me. Not only do not worship the devas, but also regarding Bhagavan, you have to worship me in a specific way. Krishna, Rupa Goswami mentions this when he defines what's Uttam Bhakti. One of the three Swarup Lakshanas of Uttam Bhakti is Krishna. Anukulyena Krishnanu Shilanam Bhakti Uttama. Krishna Anu. Krishna in Uttam Bhakti of the Gaudiya Sampradaya, Krishna is the Vishaya Alambana, and a specific type of Krishna. Sri Braja Krishna. Krishna in Vrindavan is the object of worship in our Sampradaya. Not Krishna in Mathura, not Krishna in Dwarka, what to speak of Ram, Vishnu, and so on. So this has to do also with the idea of Ananya Bhakti, or exclusive devotion. Devotion has its exclusive side, of course. At the same time, it should be inclusive for it not to be a religious fundamentalism. Recently, Guru Maharaj was given an interesting lecture on that. Now, what's the difference between exclusive devotion, Ananya Bhakti, and religious fundamentalism? Because in the name of one, you can engage in the other. So we are exclusive enough in our devotion in the sense that we try to give, to not have separate desires, and we are trying to invest everything in the direction of our object of devotion. We are exclusive in the sense that we are projecting into a very specific window of opportunity in eternity. Braja Krishna, a particular relationship, and so on. But in that exclusivity, we should be inclusive and allow other manifestations of the divine to be there and other forms of worship, because if not, our so-called exclusive devotion will be indeed considered as religious fundamentalism, and that's not becoming at all. So in this way, we have other forms, for example, regarding other forms of such as Nrsimhadev. Of course, we offer pranam to Nrsimhadev as protector of Bhakti, Bhakti Vigna Vinasana. And also we worship him in the context of Raga Marg from certain specific perspective, as Guru Maharaj had mentioned. I won't enter into detail now, it's too much to speak about that. Guru Maharaj wrote a lot, very nice articles on that regard. But again, he is not our Istadev in eternity. He is having a particular role to play in the context of we are becoming accomplished in our particular Raga Marg. And sometimes even we have seen also something important to mention. Some members of our parampara sometimes have established some deities that are not strictly in line with the ideal of our parampara. For example, Prabhupada establishing Sitaram, some places, but mainly because he felt there are some Sitaram Bhaktas here, so let's establish them, somehow or other connecting them. Rukmini, Dwarkadish, some opulence, king, royal worship. But mainly they established those deities, and not only Prabhupada as well, of course. They established these deities for the general public, like lokavichar, like some social consideration, but not meant for those engaged in one-pointed worship with proper sambandha gyan. In their siksha, they were very clear where is our goal, our prayojan. A particular type of prem, prayojan. And actually, prem is a very unique word for the Gaudiyas as well. So in this way, we should perform our worship very carefully. Our worship should be guided by proper sambandha, by proper conceptual orientation, so it gives the proper fruits. But we should do that in such a way, in such an expert way, that we are not, that nobody will think that we are against Ram, we are against Nrsimha, Vishnu, Dwarkesh, Krishna, because actually we are not against them. So we should be very expert in remaining exclusive in our goal, or nurturing, informing our goal, specifically as Gaudiyas, while at the same time not disrespecting any other forms of the God, not disrespecting even the Devas. That's the second Nama Parad. So not disrespecting the Devas. What to speak of disrespecting other forms of Bhagavan? And in this connection, sometimes someone may be, let's say, a person who is following Raga Marg, for some specific circumstances, going to a temple of Satyabhama or Rukmini or Ramachandra, the deities there, and by chance he may be obliged to worship them. No problem, she can do that in the context again of lokavichar, social convention, externally for the sake of certain circumstances, but internally, no? And if the person is not doing so, he's not incurring an offense. And if he's doing so because of understanding, it has to be done from a more relative perspective. His bhakti, her bhakti is not affected. But for a general person, it will be an offense to avoid such worship. But in the case of a Raganuga Bhakta, which has genuine greed, the avoidance of this worship is not done in a mood that will be considered offensive. You follow? I mean, we have to honor this principle of divine subjectivity. This is the famous Leela that Guru Maharaj sometimes shared concerning Hanuman. You know, when Garuda, Vishnu says to Garuda, go and tell Hanuman that I'm calling him. So Garuda goes and say, Hanuman, oh, Lord Vishnu, Sri Vishnu is calling you. Oh, Hanuman say, okay, I'll go, let's see. And Garuda gets mad, no? How can you wait to go to my Lord? So he goes back and basically says, no, he didn't come. So Vishnu said, now go and tell Hanuman that Ram is calling him. So Garuda goes and says, Ram is calling you. Sri Ram is calling you. Okay. So Hanuman said. So Garuda leaves. And when Garuda is going back to Vishnu, he sees Hanuman already having gone to Ram and going back, no? Like shouting, Sri Jai Sri Ram, flying in the sky. So the idea is that Hanuman thought, again, I won't go with Garuda because it may take too long time, and Garuda is pretty fast. So Hanuman himself went and immediately went. Rama calls me, immediately Vishnu calls me. Well, it's not the same. But again, not disrespecting, but having a particular attraction to his own Lord, to his own Istadev, the one Lord in his heart. So in this way, there is place, no, for certain negligence. If you have staunch love for your Istadev, that's the point. It shouldn't be an excuse at any level. Okay, so let's share some more points if you have some more minutes. So let's continue addressing the Vishwanath words here. So Vishwanath quotes this first part that he mentioned. This is mentioned in the Agama Shastras. So, but he implies a doubt in the verse because he says, will there not be a fault by not following scriptures like the Agama Shastras, where some of these practices, Nyasa, Mudra, and so on, worship of Rukmini, Dwarka, are mentioned and recommended even? So to this, he will quote 2 verses from the Bhagavad to say, no, there's no problem at all. So let's give some foundation to that. He will say, even if there is some discrepancy in some angas of bhakti, in the case of this Raga Bhakta, there will mean not followed in that. So to support it, he first quotes a verse from the Bhagavad, where Kavi Jogendra is speaking to Maharaj Nimi. So I already quoted there, I will read it again. In the verse, Jogendra says, O king, a person who takes shelter of the path of devotion will never be in danger. Even if he runs over this path with eyes closed, try to imagine the image, he will not trip or fall. Try to just run with your eyes closed. Probably you will fall very quickly. So in his commentary to this verse, to this Bhagavad verse, in his Sadartha Darshini commentary, Vishwanath mentions that he comments this depiction. He says, overrunning the place of one step to proceed to the next place is called dhavana, or running. And it is possible to fall after tripping even a little. If a person makes a few small mistakes or many mistakes on the path of devotion, which consists of items like Shravan and Kirtan, he will not fail, nor be hampered like on the path of karma, as you know. Just mispronouncing one word can create chaos. And he will also not be deprived of the result. It is described that even though one may have eyes, one may run with one's eyes closed. If a sadhaka knowingly, this is an important point, if a sadhaka knowingly overlooks or ignores one particular item of devotion, like this case, this verse, he will still not be at fault. Then it is needless to say that he does not commit a fault when he acts out of ignorance. So if you are aware, I will ignore this because it's not favorable, no fault. If that's this particular type of aspects, we'll see. If there are the main angas of bhakti, that's another thing. So what to speak if you neglect something out of ignorance? So here, that's an important thing to mention. No? The angas of bhakti and the angis of bhakti. No? We have the angas, which are the many practices of bhakti mentioned by Rupa Goswami, 64. But in those 64, there are the angis, sometimes called the angis, which mean the main limbs, which are not to be neglected, like Shravan, Kirtan, and so on. So if in Raga Bhakti, one person takes shelter of the main angas of bhakti, Shravan, Kirtan, there is no fault if he or she fails to observe a few of the other limbs, like some implications of the other limbs, like the ones mentioned in this verse, which are actually unfavorable for the culture of Raga Bhakti. Anantadas Babaji mentions in his commentary, he says that one important point to be noted is that the 9 kinds of bhakti, Nava Lakshan Bhakti, mentioned by Prahlad, Shravan, Kirtan, Vishnu, Smara, and so on, it's 5 limbs. It's another way of speaking of that. Panchanga Bhakti, which are the 5 last ones mentioned in the 64 of Rupa Goswami, Sadhu Sangha, Namakirtan, Bhagavata Shravan, Brajavas, and Sri Brigraha Seva, the worship of the deity. Or also its 3 main limbs that generally are mentioned in the context of Raganuga Bhakti, Shravan, Kirtan, and Smaran. He mentions, Anantadas Pandit, they are not only the main limbs of bhakti, but they are actually the origin of all other limbs. So from these main practices, let's say mainly condensed, Shravan, Kirtan, Smaran, Sadhu Sangha, Brajavas, and so on. So these are not only the main limbs, but they are the source of all other limbs. So they are the primary practice, but they are also the goal. We aspire to eternally be engaged in these types of practices. Bhaktya sanjataya bhaktya, as the Bhagavad says. Bhakti comes from bhakti, and bhakti aspires to take the form of further bhakti, if you will. We don't aspire to leave the practice of these limbs. Rupa Goswami himself mentioned that you can attain perfection through only one of these limbs, even if you really get accomplished in them. Shravan, Kirtan, Smaran. He gives examples. No, Sukadev Goswami is the Kirtanakya Guru, the one who gives example of attaining perfection by Kirtan. Parikshit is the Shravanakya Guru. Only by hearing, he attained full perfection, full accomplishment. Of course, Jiva Goswami comments, by adjoining Kirtan to all of these main practices, you attain such perfection through one practice. So this is an important point here. And on the other hand, by contrast, the process that Vishwanath mentions here, like Nyasa, Mudra, meditation, and Dwarka, and so on, they do not constitute such a substantial sadhana, which has the nature of these original limbs that we have mentioned, Shravan, Kirtan, Smara, and so on. This Nyasa, Mudra, worship of Rukmini, of Dwarka, they are merely limbs of Archana, which Archana in itself is one of the primary limbs of Bhakti. That's a fact. But these are, let's say, limbs of a limb, sub-limbs, sub-angas of one anga of Bhakti. So we are not forced, if you will, to engage in them. So not only because they are a sub-anga, we are not forced to engage in them, but mainly because they are unfavorable to the culture of the moods of Raga Bhakti. That's why exclusion of these practices is not harmful. That's the point, no? Not only we are not forced, but it's not harmful. There's no reaction. This is the point that Vishwanath is raising here. There may be some danger by neglecting Shastra somehow or other, these injunctions. No, in this type of sub-angas that are not favorable. But if you neglect the primary limbs of bhakti, these angis, this one that give rise to all of the other angas, the original primary limbs of bhakti, that will be harmful for the Raga Bhakti. If you neglect your Shravan, Kirtan, Smaran, Sadhu Sangha, Bhagavat Shravan, and so on. So, in other words, if you neglect Mudra, Nyasa, worship of Rukmini, and so on, it's not a fault, especially when you are absorbed in the main angas of bhakti. In that context, won't be a fault. You follow? It's not an excuse to neglect something, but you won't be accepting those because they are not favorable, but that implies you are absorbed in the positive favorable angas or angis of bhakti. So again, this is not an excuse for laziness for other devotees, even in other margas, that should have to follow those types of practices like nyasa, mudra, and so on. And if this is not enough, let's finish with Vishwanath mentions one more quote, one more verse, second Shastra Praman from the Bhagavad to further pound the post, where Krishna is speaking to Uddhava. I quoted already the verse there. So it says, "O Uddhava, in this endeavor of devotion, to me there cannot be even a slight loss or destruction. It's a very similar verse to the Bhagavad Gita verse, right? Neha vikramana susti pratyabhyayana vidyate swalpamapyasya dharmasya, and so on. So he's saying, no, in this path, there's no loss, nor diminution, nor danger, and so on. So we mentioned there is no fault on the path of devotion due to certain lapse of failure in one of its sanghas. But again, there will be a fault if you make a failure in one of the angis. So make the difference between anga and angi. If you neglect the main limbs of devotion, there will be some harm due to your practice. If you neglect some of the secondary angas due to your absorption in the main angis, or because they are not favorable, that implies the absorption in the main angis, there's no harm. So to solve this point, the word yan in this verse of the Bhagavad is mentioned. The word yan means that if there is a failure in the proper execution of the angis of bhakti, such as hearing, chanting, while one attempts to follow them correctly, then there is no fault. Do you follow? So we may try not to neglect our main angis of bhakti, of raga bhakti, but we may somehow or other fail in the proper execution. I think that's a fact in certain stages. So what will happen? That will harm my practice? No, it won't happen if you are trying to follow them correctly. So that's the point. You have to be sincere and honest about how much you are really sincerely making an effort to do things as you know they should be done. Then there is no fault. But if you are failing to execute the angis of bhakti, like Shravan and Kirtan, being aware you are failing and not doing the necessarily things to change that, or neglecting them altogether, or what to speak of creating your new system of practice with new excuses for not to engage in Shravan and Kirtan, that will be certainly a fault. So let's finish with the last verse that Vishwanath is quoting in this first part of the 12th verse, which is a famous verse from the Brahma Yamala, which also Rupa Goswami quotes in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. Shruti Smriti Puranadi Pancharatra Vidim Vinay Kanti Kihare Bhaktir Patayaiva Kalpate. So this is connected to the last point we mentioned. No? If you are not sincere and you don't follow Shastra at all, and in a very whimsical way, you just stop following the angas and create your own process, basically. No, I don't need to chant about Krishna, to hear about Krishna, to engage in these main angis, and nonetheless, I will attain Vrindavan or whatever. You start to speculate your own process, basically, how to engage in Raga Bhakti. So in connection to this point, Vishwanath is sharing this last praman coming from Brahma Yamala, which basically means, the verse says, if you violate the devotional principles revealed or defined in the Shruti, Smriti, Purana, and Pancharatra, and you concoct some new path of unalloyed devotion, basically you will be simply causing social disturbance. That won't take you to your goal. That's the point. You will create chaos. So what's the idea? Again, this is not fanaticism, but basically understanding that in order to reach a particular goal, there is a particular process that has been revealed and will reveal the goal eventually by the vision of the sages. So the purpose of this verse, just to finish, is that devotional practices which do not correspond with the definitions, the divisions shared in the scriptures mentioned here, Shruti, Smriti, and so on, and all these the scriptures have been narrated by seers of truth, Tattvadarshins, realized sages with perfect vision. So if whatever you follow is not matching with what they said, this is not accepted as a genuine, bona fide devotional engagement, basically. So my point is, when some kind of devotion is revealed, quote unquote revealed, and has not been mentioning but our purvacharyas, and it's not in line, but it's actually opposite to that, that's considered a social disturbance. And we have plenty of that, and that's why Bhaktivinoda Thakur pointed to these different apasampradayas and trying to make it clear this is not in line with our Goswami granthas. This will create disturbance, confusion in the name of the highest thing, sometimes engaging in the lowest. So this verse is quite famous, quite well known. It speaks about the importance of our practice has to be guided by revealed scripture, by divine, by Siddhanta, by Tattva. If we engage in bhakti without considering the revelation, our so-called bhakti may end as a total disturbance. Jiva Goswami's, let me share some words from Jiva Goswami's purport to this verse of Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, just to finish. He's mentioning, like with the mention of Shruti in this verse of the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu and other scriptures, this means that among the scriptures, we, as Gaudiya Vaishnavas, should accept the Vaishnava scriptures, for one should accept only those things for which one is qualified and not other things. No? That's what Vishwanath is saying this. As Raga-nuga sadhakas, there are some things we are qualified for. This means not necessarily it's too high or too low, but it's what matches the ideal of my school of thought, if you will. Bhagavatam is saying that. You have to discern and establish your own adhikar, not only regarding advancement, but regarding what's the ideal that you are after for the school, that is what your school of thought is giving. So Jiva Goswami finishes saying, Bhakti, without the rule of scriptures, without following, vidhim bina, means bhakti with disregard for the rules, because of having no faith in scriptures. So because this verse is saying, whatever so-called bhakti is engaged with disregard of scripture means you have no faith in scripture. That's why you are disregarding them. That's basically the whole idea, bhakti without faith. Because for us, faith means faith. Which type of faith? Shastriya Shraddha, faith in scripture, faith in revelation. As long as we don't have that type of faith, our faith will remain Komal Shraddha, which means weak faith, not very grounded in revelation. And Jiva Goswami concludes saying, it does not mean disregard because of fatigue or unintentional ignorance. That's an important point. It means disregard because you have no faith and you are doing anything to try to increase your faith. And he ends up saying, Aikantiki, this verse includes the word Aikantiki, Hare Bhakti. Aikantiki in this verse means even after having attained steadiness. So the point is, even after attaining steadiness in the practice of bhakti, if you execute your bhakti without regard from scripture because of no faith, that will produce disaster, says Jiva Goswami. So you can attain a certain level of faith and a certain level of steadiness, but at the same time, you have to take care of that steadiness and that faith, because if not, that will can produce harmful results. So some ideas I wanted to share today regarding this first part of the verse number 12 from the first illumination of Raga-vartma-candrika, where Vishwanath is mentioning the importance of being careful about not following certain elements, angas of bhakti, that may not nurture and may even affect negatively our prospect as raga sadhakas, and how he supported this with scripture, and how we should be very careful of properly following certain, not neglecting scriptures altogether, but knowing what to follow, what not to follow, in which context, with full sincerity. So in next class, he will describe the consequences of following these practices that are not recommended. What will happen if anyhow, and no matter what he said, you still continue worshiping queens of Dwarka, worshiping Dwarka, and so on? What will happen in the context of your worship to Krishna, where you will end up? So all these things will be discussed in the last second half of this 12th verse. So we will see that next class. So I'll finish here. Thank you very much to all of you for your time. And I don't know if there are any questions. We can use some moments.
What? Someone wrote something.
Question, Maharaj.
What's the question?
Mahara,
Yes.
can you hear me? Okay. What about the different temples that Prabhupada set up? And there's many temples that have worship of Sita Ram and Lakshman. And what about if somebody develops greed, but they're like serving as pujari or just even coming around or just even serving the deities? Well, what would they do? I mean, because you're saying that
Well,
you don't really need to worship them.
Yeah. Yeah, as I mentioned, no, we should understand first of all why he did so. No, it's not because he was a Ram Bhakta who was trying to take all of you to Ayodhya. So there was a specific context in which he established such worship. So we should honor that, of course, and we should honor his compassion, boundless compassion, trying to engage everyone and connect everyone into the practice of Raga Bhakti, somehow or other connect with the Raga Bhakta, even though if there's will be a Ram Bhakta, there will be some benefit there. Mahaprabhu establishing Yuga Dharma in a universal way. But I will say that if we as sadhakas, maybe in the beginning, no, we may have worshipped those deities without too much Sambandha Gyan, and just even maybe having more attraction to Ram, Sita Ram or Lakshmi Narayan or Rukmini Dwarkadis than to Radha and Krishna in Braj. At the beginning, there may be not a clear conception, but as we are growing into our practice, again, if for circumstance we are engaged in that worship, we should understand, okay, it's a circumstantial thing, but I'm not putting my whole heart internally there because that's not my projection, that's not my Istadev. Of course, you recognize your Istadev there. You see Sitaram, you say, oh, Radha Krishna, in a particular presentation, in particular mode, in particular bhava and lila. But you are not obliged, again, to worship the deity. And again, this will differ according to the degrees of advancement of each devotee. A devotee which may be more neophyte may make some sort of hodgepodge and everything is nice, want way to be sectarian, everything is the same, we have to worship Krishna, and this is Krishna. And it seems like he's an Uttam Bhakta, like he's seeing God everywhere. But he may be saying that from a neophyte perspective. So a more progressive practitioner will be more careful, as Vishwanath is pointing here, because that can affect your practice, basically. If you have to be attentive, again, what's the repercussion of this in my inner self? Is this nourishing my ideal, my chosen ideal, let's say in regarding Braj, or is creating some confusion in between? So, and again, in next part of the verse, Vishwanath will make it further clear about where you may end up if you don't take proper care of that, not to make you afraid, but just to show that if you are not really intelligent and aware of how to conduct your worship with the proper elements, you may end up in some other place apart from Golok Vrindavan, and the specific section of Golok Vrindavan we want to enter to, that will be also explained. So I hope that helps.
Yes, that was great. Thank you.
Okay, so there are some comments in the chat section by Nixon. I don't know who is Nixon. I don't see him connected, or maybe he changed his name and whatever, no problem. So first he mentioned that Rupa Goswami translates it as a disgrace and sometimes it's read as a social disturbance. Okay, no problem. Thank you for a clarification. And yes, of course, we also use the word here, harmful or disgrace. Jiva Goswami mainly his commentary mentions that. And here it's also his question asking whom to follow for developing Raga Bhakti, Ragatmika. Yes. Yeah, we explained all that in the first series and the first lectures. But yeah, Raga Bhakti implies understanding what's Ragatmika Bhakti, and that implies following the Ragatmikas who are our role model to follow. Any other question? Brigo? Yeah.
Dandavat, I have a question, or actually I have a doubt.
Okay.
I understand what Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur is saying here, that in Raga Bhakti you're following the same limbs as in Vaidhi Bhakti, but you have to do it intelligently and leave out things like worshipping the queens of Dwaraka.
Mm-hmm.
And this makes sense, of course, because in Raga Bhakti you're cultivating, just like you explained so nicely, you're cultivating a specific type of Krishna. But two of the examples that he's giving, I don't understand. And I've asked other people about this before, but nobody's ever been able to take away my doubt. So I'm putting my faith in you now, Maharaj.
Let's see.
So this is mudra and nyasa.
Mm-hmm.
This list of 64 limbs of Vaidhi Bhakti, Rupa Goswami says that it is based on the innumerable limbs found in the Hari Bhakti Vilasa.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the kind of basis. And in the Hari Bhakti Vilasa, for example, in the 5th chapter, there is an elaborate description of different types of nyasas.
Mm-hmm.
But nowhere does Sanatana Goswami there say that this is not meant for devotees. And in fact, almost all of the nyasas are, like you said, it's putting down Krishna on the body, but it's putting down the Gopala mantra on the body.
Mm-hmm.
So you put, like on the fingers, you make it into 5 parts and put one part on each of the fingers to prepare for puja and so on. And mudra also, it has to do sometimes directly with Krishna, like showing different Krishna's
Mm-hmm.
signs, but otherwise it's so. Why is Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur pointing out exactly these two? There are so many other things in the list of the 64 angas that he could have, with exactly the same kind of reasoning shown, like worshipping the Ashvatta tree,
Mm-hmm.
or putting on tilak, for example.
Mm-hmm.
I can't imagine that in the Nitya Leela they are saying Om Keshavaya Namaha, Om Narayana Namaha, Om Vamanaya Namaha, so on. That would also seem to be kind of strange from the same perspective of exclusively worshipping and loving Krishna in Vrindavan.
Mm-hmm.
So why exactly is he making a fuss about mudra and nyasa? It's found there in the Hari Bhakti Vilas. Gaudiyas, saints throughout the ages, they have been doing these things, and still today they are.
Yeah.
So this is my doubt.
Yeah. Thank you for the point. Well, first of all, one little clarification that you mentioned at the end doesn't have to do with the question mainly, but yes, regarding the tilak, that you say, well, in Vrindavan they are not putting tilak, but actually they are using tilak in Vrindavan. They are all Vaishnavas there. They are all worshippers of Vishnu. So Krishna is described as having tilak, and of course not in the mood of Aishwarya or nothing like that, but there is some, it is described gopis are using their tilak, but well, that's another thing. But regarding your question, yes, I get your point, and I know that this is not, and that's why I mentioned that it's also part of the Gaudiya practice or lifestyle on some degree, for some at least. No, the inclusion of mudra and nyasa. It's not that it's absolutely forbidden from tip to toe, and you will never see any Gaudiya having nothing to do with maybe the idea of, and that's one point, no? The idea of worshipping Dwarka and meditating on Dwarka and worshipping Rukmini, that may sound a little bit much more like overt, no? Like overtly opposite. And also I think that's why Vishwanath now is elaborating his point, as you will see in the next part of the verse, only speaking about the queens of Dwarka. No? Maybe you already read the remaining part of the 12th verse. He starts to elaborate, but only regarding the point of Dwarka and the queens of Dwarka. He's not speaking any longer about nyasa or mudra. So I think it may be an indirect way of saying that, but by mentioning these items, and after that only speaking about one of those, I think he's somehow or other leaving some space for nyasa and mudra. Of course, he also mentions Sanghangropasana, but we shouldn't conclude he's given place to that, because that's really overtly clear. I will say that. No, it's overtly clear that Gaudiya Vaishnavas are not engaging in Ahangrapasana, and it's overtly clear that Gaudiya Vaishnavas are not engaging in worship of Rukmini and Dwarka. So he elaborates on the idea of Rukmini and Dwarka in an interesting way, maybe you have seen, but maybe he's not saying anything else about Nyasa and Mudra, like giving some place to that, no? Like mentioning, of course, one may say why he didn't make it clear in full detail. Well, we are trying to fill the gap, if you will, by his grace and others. But I agree with what you say, no? That's a complementary revelation from Sanatana Goswami when he deals in detail about that in Hari Bhakti Vilas. Of course, you know better than me, Hari Bhakti Vilas is a very interesting treatise and complex in the sense of so many things are being said there and so many things are being prescribed to be done in a certain way that I think that if you try to follow them, all of them perfectly, I don't know if that's possible, basically. So it's also a lot of relativity to, and I've heard Guru Maharaj mentioning that at some part, I don't know if you will tell me, that Sanatana Goswami makes that point that this is mainly directed to Grihastha Vaishnavas. So, and I will say that that implies Grihastha Vaishnavas at that time, in a particular time, place, circumstance, where there are certain ways of approaching the practice and certain time and energy and emphasis. So I will say that in that context, because again, Hari Bhakti Vilas has to do mainly with Maryat, with decorum, with Vaishnava Achar. But we see that the books that are mainly related to Avideya, or the means, our practice as Gaudiya Vaishnava, are mainly presented by Rupa Goswami. He's not speaking about Mudra and Nyas. Again, we are not rejecting that, but there's not that main emphasis. Like I think that one of the main points of Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur here is you can neglect some of these things. I mean, some of them you should neglect, like Ahangrahopasana and Queen's worship of Queens of Dwarka. That will affect your practice. Regarding Nyasa and Mudra, they are not necessarily unfavorable, but if you reject them by being absorbed in the main angas of Bhakti, Shravan, Kirtan, Smarana, there's no harm. But there are still angas of Bhakti that there's a place for them, but they are not fundamental, and be careful of becoming like excessively attached to them and neglecting the main angas of Bhakti, not like Shravan, Kirtan in the concept of Raga-vartma. So in my case, I feel that that's the main intention of Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur behind the verse, even though he's not overtly saying some of the things we are saying now. But I perceive that he wanted to make this kind of points and putting in place all the things as it should be. So I'm not sure if I was able to finally solve your riddle, lifelong riddle, but hopefully at least some ideas may have helped there. I don't know if there's any other question before closing the session. Comments?
I've got a question. Am I coming through okay?
Yes, Krishna Chaitanya.
All right, Krishna. Well, I guess my main question is, I believe there's a bit in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu which makes the point, and I guess it's about the angis, and you may have said something about this and I spaced out. But just the whole idea of you could do all of them or one of them. You know what I'm talking about? That one could attain, I guess, I don't remember what it says you can attain, but there is at least the idea put forward that one anga could be sufficient. Srila Prabhupada said like that a lot too. So I don't know. How does this fit with everything that's been said?
Well, of course, this is said by Rupa Goswami himself in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. He mentions in his attempt also to glorify bhakti and the potency of bhakti, and it's not an exaggeration actually, he says actually bhakti is so powerful that by the practice you can attain this goal, and actually so powerful that only by fully embracing one of its main angas. Now here he's speaking about in the context of Navalaksham Bhakti, not the 64 limbs. He's speaking about here Shravan, Kirtan, Vishnu Smaram, Padasevanam, Bandhanam, Sakyam, Dasan Sakyam Atmanivedanam, Archanam, Dasan Sakyam Atmanivedanam. Because after saying that, he gives examples for each one of these 9 forms of bhakti. So he's not saying any of the 64 limbs of bhakti, worshiping the banyan tree, you can attain Golok Vrindavan, you only worship. No, he's mentioning these main 9, which are, as we mentioned, considered sometimes angis, not even angas, like angi in this case will refer to further emphasis in comparison to other aspects of bhakti. So, and of course, Rupa Goswami is saying, yes, you can just attain full perfection by proper Shravan, proper Kirtan, but of course, you have to also be sincere and say, which capacity do I have to only engage in Shravan and reach perfection, to only engage in Smaran and not combine any? I mean, he's showing the potential of the practice, but how you embrace that, that's another thing. And generally, of course, after giving examples of how someone attained perfection to each one of the practice, he gives example of Ambarish Maharaj, who attained perfection by embracing all the 9 practices together. No? And as I mentioned, Jiva Goswami comments this section by saying, yes, you can attain perfection through all the practices by mixing them with kirtan, no? Like emphasizing this is the main limb of raga bhakti, of bhakti. So, but the potential is there. No? I mean, if you are a Parikshit Maharaj, no, he said that to Sukadev Goswami, I have only 7 days remaining. Is that enough for me to attain perfection? Just hearing? And Sukadev Goswami laughed and said, 7 days? That's a lot. He gave the example of Katwanga Maharaj, who attained perfection in a moment, actually. But again, that means you are hearing fully. No? I mean, if you are hearing fully with your full attention, I don't know what that is, because I have not attained perfection yet by only hearing. But if the potential is, if you really have the capacity of fully absorbing yourself in 1 second of pure, complete Shravan, that's enough. And if you are spending 10 lifetimes in full distraction, it's not enough. So it's not a matter of time, of quantity, but of quality. Srila Maharaj will say that if you just absorb 1 second in the proper direction, that's enough. So that's the point, no? A point that Rupa Goswami wanted to make, and it's a valid point, and it remains updated, if you will. I mean, if you really embrace one practice, and eventually the point, as we mentioned, is that you will start to practice and you will develop some affinity towards some practices more than others, and sometimes some practice one specific practice. That will be another idea, no? Maybe from the very beginning you embrace all the practices, you try to get nurtured. Each case will be different, but according to how you progress, you may find some specific affinity into the direction of whatever, Shravan, Kirtan, and by going deep into that direction properly, you may attain all perfection. So, but again, this is not a fixed rule. Each one should, let's say, make her own process, but not by speculating, but by properly mixing in different degrees these different practices according to how feels that sustainable, with the guidance of Guru, with the blessing of the Vaishnava, in the context of scripture. Again, not going against this verse from Brahma Yamala, creating your own concocted process. That someone may have an affinity. I have affinity for Shravan, for Kirtan, for Smaran, for Archanan, and that can be applied. I have affinity for Nyasa and Mudra in the context of the Gopal mantra. Okay, there's a place where I have affinity for worshiping the cows. Okay, that's one of the angas of bhakti also. So, I mean, but again, all this should be made not as an excuse to avoid all other things or those things who are mainly favorable to Raga Bhakti. No, okay, I'm worshiping the cow, but it doesn't mean I will never read Bhagavatam again, will never chant in Kirtan anyhow because I'm with my cow. I mean, if you really understand in which context the worship of the cow is done, you will be inspired by the cow herself to go and chant your rounds and do kirtan with her eventually, and so on. So in this way, no, it shouldn't be a black and white understanding of the idea, but there's some flexibility to it. But at the same point, the point stands still. I mean, you can attain full perfection by embracing one of the main angas of bhakti. That's the point of Rupa Goswami in the context of this. So I hope that helps. So thank you very much to all of you. I think we can stop here. We have already spoken quite a lot. So Srila Gurudev ki jai, Shriman Mahaprabhu ki jai, Shri Harinam Sankirtan ki jai, Shri Raga-vartma-candrika ki jai, Shri Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur Pad ki jai, Gaur Bhakta Vrinda ki jai, Gaur Premananda Haribo, Vanchakalpataru Vyashtakripa Sindhubhyai Vacha, Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha, Nanta Koti Vaishnava Vrinda ki jai, Gaur Haribo.